we received, I guess, very hostile reactions, ranging from threatening emails. I received an email from a fairly prominent economist who threatened me that he's going to lie to every economist he knows in Canada. This was before my tenure, and is going to make sure that I'm not going to get tenure. There were a variety of different reasons, or I would say excuses, provided for rejecting our work. One of the top 5 journals we submitted the paper to just rejected the paper in 20 minutes, and the rationale provided was that we do not publish papers about our own profession. My name is Mohsen Javdani. I'm an associate professor of economics at the University of British Columbia, at the Okanagan campus. Mainstream economics puts a strong emphasis on the positivist conception of the discipline, often characterizing economists as objective and non-ideological. For example, the widely influential essay by Milton Friedman in 1953, the methodology of positive economics. In that piece of essay, he suggests that positive economics is or can be an objective science in precisely the same sense as any of the physical sciences. Many other prominent economists have also suggested that economics is as amoral, non-normative, or non-ideological as physics, chemistry, or mathematics. You can also see this in what has been described as natural science-like textbooks in economics, which present the discipline as a strongly cumulative body of, I guess, what you could describe as objectively correct knowledge. It is against this backdrop, this prevalence of positivist methodology in economics, which has virtually eclipsed all the other competing views, that we ask this question about the extent to which economists could be influenced by ideological bias. And to do this, of course, this type of behavior, when it comes to biases or discriminatory behavior or prejudices, you can't just simply walk up to people and ask them if they're biased or if they're prejudiced against a certain group of people or not. So we basically use a method that has been used before in economics, especially in labor economics, for example, to study discrimination in the labor market. So we use what is known as a randomized control trial. And what we do is we invite economists from 19 different countries to participate in an online survey. And we present to them a series of 15 statements on a wide range of topics. And we ask them to evaluate these statements to basically indicate the degree to which they agree or disagree with these statements, which are on a wide range of topics. And most of them are from prominent mainstream economists. But what they don't know is that at the very beginning of the survey, they are randomly sorted into 3 different groups. So our control group are those who receive basically these statements, but they are attributed to what we describe as mainstream sources. The treatment 1 are those who receive identical statements in the same order, but for this group, these statements are attributed to what we describe as less or non-mainstream sources. So basically the difference between the 2 groups of sources is that they hold different views, or if you want, ideologies. They have different distances to mainstream views, and we pick these sources in a way that these are widely known, that are very easily identifiable by economists who read these statements. And then, of course, there's a third group for whom we completely remove the attributed source. And the implementation of the 2 treatments is to be able to distinguish between what we call ideological bias versus authority bias. The idea behind ideological bias is whether people tend to agree more with statements that are attributed to sources who happen to confirm their prior beliefs and ideas. And the distinction we make between ideological bias and authority bias is that when it comes to authority bias, people might not hold a strong ideological views about different sources. It's just that the presence of an authoritative figure, for instance, a prominent economist, might make them more likely to agree with those statements. So the distinction we make between the two is that when it comes to authority bias, people might not hold particularly ideological or strong views about different sources. It's just that because they are considered as authority figures in the discipline, they happen to agree more with the views. For example, if I show you a poem and I tell you that this is from an English teacher as opposed to a famous poet, you might think that it's a very good poem when I tell you that this is from a very famous poet. You don't hold any particular ideological views. It's just that this famous poet makes you think that this is a more valuable piece of art. So that's basically the distinction we make between the two. And what we look at, it's a very basically simple idea, is to see when we change the sources from mainstream to less or non-mainstream sources, whether the level of agreement with these statements change. And what we find is that indeed, when sources are changed from mainstream to less or non-mainstream, the agreement level with these statements drops significantly among economists. Another very interesting finding is that at the very end of the survey, when people have gone through these statements, we ask them a series of questions. And one of the questions we ask them is, how do you think a statement or argument should be evaluated? And we give them three options. The first option is that it should be evaluated based on its content only, which is the view consistent with the positivist methodology in economics. The second option is that it should be evaluated based on the views of the author the statement is attributed to. And we also give a middle ground option, which is it should be evaluated based on both the combination of the content as well as the views of the author. The interesting thing we find is that a strong majority of economists, actually 82% of them, report that statements and arguments should be evaluated on the basis of their content only. But our results basically suggest the exact opposite, that they are strongly influenced by the views and ideologies of the sources that are attributed to these statements, which potentially suggests that part of the ideological bias we find in our results is functions through unconscious modes, which makes them, in fact, even more important to basically think about. Another aspect that I want to highlight when it comes to our results is the gender dimension, if you want me to briefly talk about that. So if we look at heterogeneity by many different characteristics, including gender, and what we find is that women are less biased than men. In fact, our estimated treatment effect when we change sources is 44% smaller for women than for men. In other words, when we change sources, women are less likely to change their agreement level, or the drop in the agreement level is significantly smaller than men. And there's one statement that particularly talks about the gender problem in economics. So this is a statement that talks about the fact that the economics discipline hasn't been very successful compared to many other disciplines in addressing its gender issue, and this is a very serious problem that needs to be addressed in economics. Now, what we find is that there is a very significant divide between male and female economists in the understanding of the gender problem in economics. So when you look at the agreement level and differences between men and women, even when the statement is attributed to the mainstream source, which is Carmen Reinhardt from Harvard University, men are significantly less likely to agree with this statement. So there's a very large divide between men and women in their understanding and the recognition of this problem in economics. The other thing we find which is interesting is that when we change the source from Carmen Reinhardt to the left-wing British sociologist / psychologist Diane Elson, we find that for men, the agreement level drops by 14%. For women, there's virtually no impact on the agreement level. One potential explanation is that for women, when it comes to the issue of gender problems and gender discrimination in the discipline, they basically put aside ideology because this is something they have personally experienced and focus more on the content of the statement, so they're not really influenced by the change in source compared to the male counterparts. Another very important thing we find that I would like to briefly discuss is the difference by political orientation. We ask people to report their political orientation on a scale from -10 to 10, far left to far right. And the interesting pattern we find is that for those who self-identify as the far left, the effect is very small. So when we change the source, the reduction in agreement level is in fact very small. But as we move to the far right, this reduction in agreement level, when we change sources, becomes very large. So in fact, it increases by, I think, around 700% when we go from the far left to the far right. And interestingly, this is despite the fact that those who self-identify as being at the far right are significantly more likely to say that you should evaluate a statement on the basis of its content only. So if anything, you would expect to find a smaller effect among this group. But again, what we find is that this group is much more strongly influenced by the changes in sources and what we call ideological bias. One important question that is raised by our finding is that what are the roots of this ideological bias? What are the driving factors behind the ideological bias we find? Now, of course, this is a very difficult question to answer, but when you look at the work of social scientists who have studied the issue of ideological bias, what we find is that the main source of ideological bias seems to be knowledge-based. It seems to be influenced by institutions that produce discourse. Now, it is well understood that mainstream economics is the most dominant and the most influential institution in economics today. And I think there are at least two mechanisms through which mainstream economics can shape and can influence ideological views among economists. One is through economic education. Now, of course, economic education influences the way students process information, identify problems, and approach these problems in their research. Not surprisingly, it also affects the policies they favor and the ideologies they adhere to. Now, there is, I would say, concerning evidence based on survey studies that suggests students in economics, and this is based on surveys of top graduate programs in economics in the US, that graduate students think that technical expertise are the key to success when it comes to graduate school, while knowledge about the economy and about the history of economic thought or economic methodology helps very little. Now, the reason that this is very concerning is that the lack of depth in knowledge acquired, not only in economics and among economics students, but among any group of individuals, makes people to lean more easily on ideology. And there's also growing evidence that suggests students in economics, compared to many other disciplines, are more likely to exhibit attitude that is associated with greed, with selfishness, with free riding, and so this highlights the importance of economic education and how it can affect and shape ideological views among students. I think the other mechanism that is important to pay attention to are the social structures and norms within the discipline. Now, of course, these social structures and norms exist in any academic discipline, but again, there is increasing evidence that suggests that economics stands out in certain respects when it comes to these social structures and norms in ways that results in centralization of power and in creation of incentive mechanisms for research that further hinder plurality and encourage group thinking and delineates biased research parameters. So I think this is another channel through which these ideological biases could be shaped and could be propagated within the discipline. And it's through these two factors that I think we can gain a better understanding about these ideological biases and how we can tackle those issues. Because our results and the significant heterogeneity we find across different groups, by country, by area of research, by gender, so on and so forth, suggest that there's a lot of variation in the extent to which people exhibit these biases, which basically suggests that there are ways to diminish these biases and there are ways to enforce them. It'd be important to also very briefly talk about my personal experience while working on this project. While this is more of a personal account, but I think this could be illuminating and provide some important insights into what we actually find in our project. The experience that I had working on this project, the reaction I received from the discipline was actually surprising. It was what I would describe as troubling and disheartening, to say the least. We received, I guess, very hostile reactions, ranging from threatening emails to very unprofessional, hostile reactions in conferences, or again through different emails that we received. To give you an example, I received an email from a fairly prominent economist who threatened me that he's going to lie to every economist he knows in Canada. This was before my tenure, and is going to make sure that I'm not going to get tenure. And then, of course, our experience having submitted this paper to journals in economics has also been very disappointing. So we have been now through 15 or 16 economic journals over the last year, and a very strong majority of these journals have even refused to send our paper to even reviewers. So that basically, most of them basically desk rejected our paper. Only a very small number of these journals sent them to reviewers. And then, of course, given the subjective nature of this evaluation process and a concerning lack of accountability, I would say, there were a variety of different reasons, or I would say excuses, provided for rejecting our work. So to give you a couple of examples, one of the top 5 journals we submitted the paper to just rejected the paper in 20 minutes, and the rationale provided was that we do not publish papers about our own profession. Another journal rejected the paper, suggesting that we have provided interesting and convincing evidence about the effect of ideological bias, but we have had little to say about the origins of ideological bias and also the actual real-world consequences of ideological bias, as if we can basically resolve the entire issue in one paper. I think one deserves probably a Nobel Prize if you can basically speak to all these issues in one paper. So we have really received a variety of different, I would say, excuses for rejecting this paper and for not publishing it, which is, again, very I guess, disappointing, but it hasn't been discouraging. So we continue to try to publish this work in an outlet that we think will allow other people to basically find out about the work that we have done.